Welcome to episode 19 of the Aspiring STEM Geek. In this episode, I talk with Srikar Katta. Srikar is a PhD researcher at Duke University. In the episode, we discuss causal inference, a field closely related to statistics. We also review two papers that Srikar helped write, one on wearable devices and the other on political polarization. I also want to correct a statement that I made within the episode. I referenced a paper on blood centrifuges and I attributed it to the wrong author. I linked the paper in the description below. Apologies for any confusion. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Srikar Katta, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here.
Yeah, I know you're a computer scientist but I also think you're a statistician. So you are the first statistician to come on the podcast. I'm excited about that.
Well, I'm honored. I hope I don't give statisticians a bad name. If I do, you can blame it on me being a computer scientist.
When it comes to am I a statistician or not, even I myself am like, I don't know, especially relative to some of the people that we both know. And I'll bring up the mutual professor that we had and how intimidating he was intellectually to me.
No, I can definitely agree on that. There's some very, very smart statisticians out there that continue to baffle and amaze me today, and I'm sure forever and ever.
Yeah, and stats is a great field. I highly recommend you look into it for anybody that's curious or listening. But let's start from the beginning. Growing up, were you interested in science and math?
I guess the answer is kind of yes and no. For me, a lot of the time depended on just like who was teaching me whatever field. I don't think there was ever anything that like drew me to science and math or like history and English more than just like what was actually the way it was being delivered and taught to me. So I had some really influential math and science teachers while growing up that made me super interested in it. But I don't think I was ever like, oh, this is my life, this is my passion, in the same way that it is now. And I just recognize how much of a nerd that makes me sound like. But I think it kind of is true. Like, I think math and like computer science and statistics are kind of my bread and butter now, and a lot of what my life revolves around. So when I was younger, I definitely was not as passionate about it as I am now.
Yeah, I mean, I was probably even less so passionate about just everything in general. In high school, I described myself as apathetic. Community college, I started to care a little bit more. Then I had a job where I worked as a HVAC assistant, and I saw how rough that was. It was like, okay, let me get more serious. And then actually, like you were saying, having great professors. So we both went to Temple University for my undergrad. I did finance and economics, and it was really talking to the professors after class that got me really into academia.
Yeah, no, that's super cool. I think, professors really can make or break it. And finance and economics is super cool and obviously very distinct from statistics, but definitely has its overlaps too. So somehow we all find our way back to the data world.
Yeah, exactly. But for your undergrad at Temple University, you dual majored in math and computer science. Why did you choose to dual major?
So I guess I started off wanting to do psychology and economics, mainly because I didn't really know what else to study, and human behavior seemed really cool. And economics, just a backup in case I wanted to make a lot of money and had nothing else. But I started working in this psychology and economics, this neuroeconomics lab at Temple. And they were doing some really cool stuff, studying human decision making and using neuroimaging techniques to do this.
What's the name of the lab?
It's called the Neuroeconomics Lab, run by Dr. David Smith in the Temple Psychology Department. And they were doing some super cool stuff. And as I was working with them, one of the PhD students took me under their mentorship and was teaching me about how to code in R, which is the statistical programming language, and how to think about analyzing data and interpreting data and visualizing it. And I was like, oh, this is actually kind of cool and interesting. Is there something more I can do with data? And they were like, why don't you look more into math and statistics? So I started looking more into math, and Temple had a mathematical economics major at the time. So I went down that rabbit hole. And then I was like, economics is cool, but I could just do more of like the computer science stuff. And I wanted to do the stats major at Temple, but it was in the business school. And tuition at the business school was like 8K more expensive than tuition in the science and technology school. So I was like, why don't I just stay here? And
I wish I knew
will just
that.
if the one thing the economics has taught me is marginal cost must equal the marginal benefit. And the computer scientists and math were pretty cool and were good for teaching me that. So they had a data science major at the time. And so I was going to take all of that, but they had so many course requirements. And at some point, I was like, what is the easiest major for me to just graduate with? And Temple has this joint major between math and computer science. So I was like, okay, it looks like that's it. So I just went down that path, and it turned out great.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I think we'll talk about this later, but one of the things that I really loved about statistics as I was using it more and more for financial modeling and learning about risk management is it's generalizable to so many different fields. You can do biostatistics, you can do computer science, you can do computer engineering, you can do old school manufacturing, and statistics is relevant in all of those.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think now we live in a world where data is king. And no matter what you do, you're probably touching numbers or data or communicating statistics in some way, shape, or form. And so it really is this nice bridge to allow you to engage with a bunch of different disciplines while still having this kind of nice home base. And that's, I think, what I really like about it, because I get to work with medical experts and psychologists and sociologists without ever needing to be a domain expert in any one of these individually. And I'm very far from an expert in statistics too, but at least a little bit more of a home base for me.
Yeah. So our time at Temple did overlap. I was going for my master's degree. I'm pretty sure you were still in your undergrad. And I think I met you in one Professor Edo Eraldi's classes. So that's the professor that's very smart. And at the same time, I've described him as probably the smartest person I've had a chance to interact with on a continuous basis. So very, very, very smart. So I also remember you were in one of the seminar courses that we both attended. I don't remember the topic, but I do remember you read and analyzed a academic paper and presented your thoughts on it. So in that course and a lot of other courses, on the graduate level, I was personally intimidated by how smart everybody was. And I definitely thought I wasn't on the same level. So I'm just curious, you were there as an undergraduate. How did you feel about attending those graduate level courses?
I was absolutely terrified. And it, like, reading those papers, I think I had to spend like the whole week. No other course mattered. Like, those papers are so dense and they're so math heavy and so notation heavy, and all for like really intuitive and simple concepts. But it's just like the language that statisticians and mathematicians use is very different than the language that people use day to day. And trying to adapt to that is really crazy, especially when all the other people in that room use that same language to speak. And I'm like, oh no, what is happening right now? But then, I started to hang out a little bit more with some of the students outside of class, and they were all really chill and really interesting. And so I think just getting to realize that they're also human beings, and that Edo is also a human being that jokes, really helps humanizes them a lot and kind of takes them off this pedestal. And definitely recognizing that they're all insanely intelligent, like you were mentioning, and can have really, really intellectual discussions. But they're also humans at the end of the day, and they're fun to hang out with. Really helped me figure out that, okay, this is not as doesn't need to be as scary as it seems from the outset. I don't know. What was your experience with that?
Yeah, it's the same thing. I think I was, as always, like I have so many things going on, so I didn't have a chance to connect as much as I probably should have. But yeah, getting to interact professor, this was also towards the tail end of COVID. So compared to it, I'm pretty sure that you're enjoying your PhD courses a lot more relative to COVID university. But I could definitely tell the difference in undergrad. I think I graduated 2016 from undergrad, and I was able to go to a professor's class after, or to where their office afterwards and talk to them. So it was a bit harder to chase people down, even with Zoom. So I noticed that difference. I still enjoyed it. I guess to kind of go back to one of Professor Edo's papers, yeah, I don't know if it was in the seminar course or another course, but what really, at this time I already decided I'm going to major in statistics, get my master's degree, but his experience really solidified, like, I'm going to work in this field, because he did everything from consulting with tech companies like Meta, and I'm not quite sure if it's Apple or some other ones. And also he was able to go to a medical company. I remember a paper that he wrote on blood centrifuges. So that's when a machine that spins blood, there was some issue with the machine itself. So it was an engineering issue. And through statistical modeling, he was able to help them fix their engineering issue. So, yeah, I mean, those papers were amazing, and it just solidified, like, yes, I want to be in statistics, because it goes back to, it's so generalizable, and I can go to whatever field that really inspires me.
No, definitely. I think Edo is insanely smart, and just talking to him, I feel lesser than, even though he's very humble and doesn't make you feel that way, or doesn't intend to make you feel that way. But he really is very, very intelligent and has worked on so many different domains. And talking to him, I feel like just through osmosis, I pick up new things. So yeah, he's worked in so many different areas, and in many ways, he's like the kind of researcher I aspire to be, where like whatever field or domain somebody has, you can help them solve whatever problem they want to solve using statistics. And like that blood centrifuges thing reminds me of this other paper where they put a dead salmon inside an MRI. And somehow that MRI caught signals. And it's like, whoa, 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 what's going on? There's absolutely no electrical conductions that's happening at all. Why is this the case? And it was purely just due to statistical error. The machine itself was corrupted, or not the machine itself was corrupted, but MRI scanners are not perfect. They don't do 100% all the time exactly what they intend to. And so they will just pick up random noise at certain times. And that's exactly what happened. And understanding statistics and how that plays together helps solve some really curious questions that are academic, but also, as you mentioned, really important for industry across a wide variety of domains.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And another pitch, if you're an undergraduate or if you're looking to get into another field, statistics it's a great one to be in.
Yeah, I would highly recommend. I think now a lot of people are calling it data science too. So, one of those, it leads to a lot of different opportunities.
Yeah, that data science, machine learning, AI, at the core of it, it's math and statistics at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think a lot of the tools are similar. I think it's maybe a difference in cultures, possibly. But
yeah.
You definitely learn a lot of things that are relevant to a bunch of different fields.
Yeah. So after you graduated from Temple, you started your PhD in computer science at Duke University, where you currently reside. Why did you choose Duke?
That's a really good question. So when I was graduating from undergrad, I thought I was just going to go straight into industry, not even do a PhD. And then I was chatting with one of my professors, and we had a really good conversation, and we were just chatting about random things, about random research. And he's like, "Did you have fun?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "Then why don't you just consider doing a PhD? The worst case, you will like have somebody else pay for your master's degree, and then you'll walk out of here. You don't have that much of a risk. And right now, the tech industry is booming. You'll find a job super easily." And at the time, that was true. So I was like, okay, why don't I try to apply to some programs, and I think a lot of the times when people are looking for PhD programs, they typically focus on people to work with. And at Duke, I had this really interesting set of combination of advisors, one of whom, Alex Wolfowski, is a traditionally trained statistician that works with political scientists to understand political polarization in the United States and beyond, especially as it relates to political polarization on social media. And I was like, well, that is so cool that you can be in statistics and still answer such like insanely important questions for society today. And then my other advisor, Cynthia Rudin, who also works with Alex on a bunch of other really important problems, her work is super interesting and has been used in criminal justice, has been used for medical decision making, and is deployed in hospital systems right now. She sits on government panels and boards, and I was like, wow, that's a really neat way to make impact. So these two advisors and that combination of having these different perspectives, I thought was really interesting and would make for, at the very least, a very interesting 5-6 years of the PhD, if not a future career.
Yeah. Well, that gets me into my next question. So you mentioned that you have two advisors, Cynthia Rudin and Alex Wolfosky. Oh boy, how do you pronounce
That's
it?
okay. I also butcher his name, Alex V.
Alex.
I think.
I'm sorry, Alex V. As somebody that's Eastern European, I should be able to pronounce this, but how has it been to have two advisors? Because typically in a PhD program, you pretty much have just one advisor.
I think like there's never a free lunch. That's a short machine learning joke. But there's no free lunch. So there are some downsides to having two advisors. And the main one is both of them give really good advice, but sometimes they give contradictory and conflicting advice. And then you are left in the position of, oh no, what do I do? And that's like the biggest downside. But the nice thing is that you're getting really good advice from both perspectives, and you can't really go wrong whichever one you choose. It's not like choosing one will devastate your career. They both are very successful and know what they're talking about, and are very intelligent. So I think like that's one of the biggest pluses, that you get exposed to a bunch of different perspectives. The downside, especially early on, was feeling like I would disappoint one of them if I didn't follow their advice. But at the end of the day, they're here like to help me grow. And as long as I'm doing that, neither of them are going to be disappointed by what I do. And they're, again, both really nice human beings. So that really helps, take the edge off a little bit.
Yeah. I was actually randomly thinking about just optimal choice. It's usually, I mean, you can apply this to so many things, but as long as you don't have something that's too suboptimal, if it's near optimal, meaning it's second, third best decision, usually it turns out fine. So yeah, so it's a good problem to have, where one of them may be the optimal decision, and one of them may technically be suboptimal, but it's only the second or third, or it's the second best choice. And if you compare it to all the other advice, it's probably better than average.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree. I think most of the time they both give either the first or second best piece of advice. So you can't really go wrong either way.
Yeah, so it works out. So I want to get into two papers that you wrote, one measuring data from wearable devices and then another on political polarization. But before we do that, I want to define some of the statistical methods that you used within both the papers. So starting from the top, what is causal inference?
That is a great question. So causal inference is the study of how can we identify and quantify the causal effect of some treatment or intervention on some outcome. And I use a bunch of other jargon, which I apologize for. But at a high level, it's just answering the question, what's the effect of something on something else? And it can be as vague as, what is the effect of, being happy on eating ice cream, or something more specific, like what is the effect of smoking on lung cancer? And quantifying this is really helpful and useful for decision making more on, to decide, okay, do I really want to eat ice cream? Will that increase my happiness? I might have had the original question flipped around. I apologize, but what's the effect of ice cream on happiness? That helps you decide, do you actually want to eat ice cream for your happiness? Or for cancer and cigarette smoking, it's understanding, should there be policies and interventions aimed at limiting and constraining people from smoking to ensure that their public health is more secure? And so causal inference is all about the study of, how do you infer causal relationships from some data or some world that you observe?
Yeah, and statistics. There's always a lot of the focus is on correlation rather than causation, and there can be things that are spurious correlations. So there's plenty of examples, but I think the famous one is the margarine consumed in Maine and then divorce rates in Maine, and you can see that they're correlated, meaning the more margarine consumption there is, the data is also showing that the higher the divorce rate is. But if you just think about it logically, margarine consumption or fake butter isn't going to cause divorce. I mean, if it does, and that's a pretty wild breakthrough that we found.
No, absolutely. That I actually haven't heard that one. That is really funny. But I think, yeah, that is funky. I will mention though, like if you can figure out if your goal is to try and predict whether people will get divorced or how many people will get divorced, if margarine consumption is a good indicator of that, then go for it. Use it if your goal is prediction. But when your goal is decision making, you typically want more robust insight than just is something correlated or related to this, and instead you want to understand maybe how robust is that correlation to other possible explanations. Like, sure, it could be that margarine consumption goes up when divorce rates are going up, but it could also be that people are buying fake butter instead of real butter because of economic downturn. And now economic downturn is that explanation. So considering other possible explanations for the world that you observe is really what causal inference is all about, and trying to figure out is the question you're asking due to this or something else.
Yeah, no, and we'll dig into that further. And within causal inference, what is an outcome?
That's a great question. So an outcome is just whatever you care about studying as an endpoint. So I mentioned a treatment or an intervention in this example of what is the effect of eating ice cream on your happiness. Ice cream would be your intervention because that's what you want to know the why about. And then your outcome would be happiness because that's what you want to quantify the effect on. I don't know if that made sense. I'm happy to clarify further.
Yeah, I think it does. It's if I eat more ice cream, will I be happier?
Yeah, exactly.
And, I'm sure. I mean, that'd be interesting. It's one of those where the marginal ice cream or the next ice cream you eat after a certain point, I assume you stop being happy because you're on your 10th or 12th ice cream.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely some sort of diminishing returns at some point. But at a high level, these types of questions are just, does it not? It can go much deeper than that in quantifying how much or how much does it not.
Yeah. So ice cream, happiness, that's the outcome, that where the ice cream's the intervention. We want to know if that affects happiness. That's the outcome. Still want to go through and define a few more things for causal inference. What are treatments and controls within an experiment?
That's also a very good question. So I guess first, a treatment is when you turn on this feature or this intervention that you care about. So in this hypothetical universe of studying the effect of eating ice cream on your happiness, your treatment would be, well, why don't we actually force feed you ice cream or give you ice cream? That would be the treatment arm. And now the control arm is all the people that you're comparing against. So the people that don't eat ice cream or the people that eat something that resembles, is as close to ice cream as possible, but still is not ice cream.
Yeah. So maybe, oh man, what's the yogurt one called? Why am I blanking on that?
Oh, why am I also forgetting this?
Yeah, so
oh my gosh, yeah,
that
one.
Frozen yogurt. So you can have ice cream or frozen yogurt. Those are relatively close. In this case, the treatment would be the ice cream and the control would be the yogurt, right? Okay.
Yeah, so bars. That's what I'm thinking. Okay, sorry. I had to.
No worries. And so a few more things that I still want to define. This is really, really important. And we actually mentioned this earlier. What is a confounding variable? But let's explicitly define that.
Yeah, so a confounding variable is some other possible explanation of the phenomenon you're observing. So for this margarine, butter, and divorce case, it could be that margarine, butter, and divorce are both correlated with something else, and that something else causes both of these, and that is what is driving this effect. That something else could be economic downturn. So economic downturn, or in times of economic downturn, people buy more margarine, and in times of economic downturn, the economic stress causes people to have more divorce. But it's not really that margarine butter is what is leading people to having divorce. It is this economic downturn. So this is what we call a confounding variable, something that causes both the treatment that you care about and the outcome that you care about, but messes up this relationship in some way.
Yeah. And then the final thing that I want to define before we actually get into the papers is, what is an experiment and how do you set one up?
Awesome. So these questions that we've been like talking about are super hypothetical. Like, what's the effect of ice cream on happiness, or what's the effect of margarine consumption on divorce rates? And these are really, really hard to answer in practice. But if we were able to, in a hypothetical universe, get a bunch of people and we randomly gave some of these people our treatment. So we randomly gave some of them ice cream, and then we randomly gave other people some placebo that looks really, really similar to ice cream, but is not ice cream. And now you can
Yogurt.
compare happiness between these two people. So yeah, the Yasso bar yogurt. Now you can compare happiness between these two groups. And that would allow you to conclude that there is some causal effect of ice cream or happiness or not. And the reason why is because you've essentially eliminated any other possible explanation because the treatment was randomized. There's no other possible cause for why people received ice cream or the yogurt bar other than random chance. And so the power of randomization is that it allows you to isolate these causal effects, and an experiment tries to target that. And experiments can be super, super simple in this like ice cream versus not ice cream example, or they can be much more complicated in settings when your treatments are much more complicatedly designed. And I think we'll talk about this later, for example, with like text.
Yeah. Well, for those interested in experiments, because this is applicable to so many fields, and it's really prevalent in the medical field, for that, one of the gold standard ones was the Salk vaccination that happened in the 1950s. So this was, polio was a infectious disease that was very harmful, especially to children. So what a John Salk, I think it was John Salk, but I can't, but he's a virologist. He came up with this polio vaccine, and he really had the gold standard for setting up the experiment. So the treatment was the vaccination, the control was the placebo or the sugar pill, and there was something called replication, where they had this all across the United States, but they also had this in Canada and Finland as well. And they were able to replicate the experiment in all those places to be pretty close to each other, which is really important. You had blinding, where the patient, they don't know if they're receiving the placebo or the vaccine. That's also very important. And then also the randomness. So they just had some sort of simple random sampling that they used in order to give either the treatment or the control. But for anybody that's interested, it's really interesting. I bring it up in my statistics classes, but it's the gold standard, and it's really worth reading about if you want to know how to set up an experiment.
Yeah, no, I agree. I completely forgot about that one. But I think, yeah, there's a bunch of really interesting cases of how people have studied and isolated causal effects before this world where we define rigorously what experiments are. And I think they came up with some really neat and inventive ways of actually isolating these effects.
Yeah, yeah. So let's get into the first paper. And this is kind of related to the medical field, and it's wearable devices. But so the title of this, and I linked all your papers in the description, Interpretable Causal Inference for Analyzing Wearable Sensor and Distributional Data. Here, you and your colleagues research the optimal way to analyze and present data from continuous glucose monitors, or CGMs for short. These devices monitor the blood glucose or sugar levels of an individual, which is very important for people who have diabetes. For people with diabetes, a concern is hypoglycemia, where the blood glucose levels of an individual are very low. The risks of hypoglycemia for an individual with diabetes can be as severe as slipping into a coma or death. How do you decide to analyze the data from CGMs? So I'll refer to that as short for continuous glucose monitors, and not a different wearable device such as a heart rate monitor on a watch.
Yeah, that is kind of a story. So when I first started the PhD, they asked me what do I want to work on, and I was like, well, I don't really know. I kind of had this idea, and it was based on this project I did back at Temple, where I was doing some analysis for this Philly-based startup GoPuff, which is like this digital delivery service that just delivers you snacks, basically. It's Uber Eats for snacks.
Yeah, man.
And then
I was in college when that came out, and I was like, oh man, I wish I had the entrepreneurship to figure that out.
right. In hindsight, it's like such a easy
Yeah.
like product, but they really scaled it up and they did great stuff. And back during COVID, I mentioned I was like working with these psychologists, and I was really interested in understanding, well, did COVID and like this disaster help people, or did it encourage people to become more altruistic, or did it help them to think of others beyond just themselves in a selfless kind of way? And there are some psychologists that argued that tips are a way of measuring that, because you really have no economic reason to tip. You are paying more money for no gain. You already got your service. You are like, that's the big reason for it. And so psychologists said, well, one of the reasons could be altruism. It could be the case that people just want to do something out of the goodness of their heart. And so I said, hey, maybe tipping could be a cool way of analyzing this. So I talked to this buddy of mine who was working at GoPuff, who was also taking some classes at Temple. And I asked him if he could share some data. And he's like, yeah, sure. So he shared it, and I used it for this course project. And in that, the hard question though was, well, how do I actually summarize and aggregate data from tips? So I wanted to compare tipping behavior before COVID and after COVID. And so I was like, okay, I'll just look at average tips before COVID and average tips after COVID. But the issue is that tips follow this weird kind of distribution where 80% of people don't tip at all. And then the 20% of people who do tip about 20% of the check.
That's like, a hard rule for me. I like minimum 20%. I need to tip.
Oh, yeah. No, that's a good rule. And some people have those hard rules to follow, but a lot of people also don't, especially when it comes to like gig workers. I think it was such a new thing, especially during college, that I don't think, especially for college students, which was the market that GoPuff dominated, they had formalized their like moral compass to decide what they're going to do and how they're going to tip. So they were probably the most motivated by COVID. And so what I really wanted to do was understand, well, how do we actually characterize and summarize these tips? And it presented this weird problem of, well, the average is probably not capturing enough, because it's possible that the proportion of people who tip zero goes down, but then the people who did tip before and who will now tip later, like the average that they tip goes up. And so the average tip could stay the same before and after COVID, but the distributions themselves can change. And being the nerd that I am, I was thinking about this and I was like, yeah, this actually happens in a lot of different domains. It happens in glucose monitors, for example, where if I just looked at your average glucose level, well, your average could stay the same, but your super low or super high glucose levels could shift. Or if you're looking at heart rate, same thing, your super high, super low heart rates could shift, but your average could stay the same, and they could offset things. And so when I came to the PhD, we were talking, and they were like, that's super cool, but it would be cool if you could find some data for it. And the hardest part about research, I think, ever, is just getting good data. And there was this clinical trial run by the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation that had really nice continuous glucose monitoring data. And so we tried it out, and it seemed like it made a lot of sense to use this, because the standard way people summarize these continuous glucose monitor data is by just calculating how often is someone's glucose level within some certain range.
Yeah. So you had all the raw data. So you had every single data point from it for whatever the interval is, every second, every 5 seconds. And
so glucose monitors was back in 2007. So they didn't take it at such a high frequency. They took it at about once every 5 minutes, but that's still a way more frequent frequency than like the standard approach at the time, and even till today, which is just you take a prick of your blood and another device will measure it for you, and you record it like once or twice or maybe even 4 times a day.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that's what was I'll bring this up again, but I remember growing up, one of my really good friends, he developed type 1 diabetes when we were early teenagers. And yeah, so can't remember where it was, but I don't think continuous glucose monitors were readily available. And then decade ago, maybe a little more, he got a continuous glucose monitor. And in terms of convenience, especially, I know that he really likes the device.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people have really understood how valuable having access to a wealth of information about how your body functions can be really, really useful, especially for people with these really concerning diseases like diabetes, or with people that have heart conditions or arrhythmia. Like now the Apple Watch will check if you do have heart arrhythmia, and being able to know that for someone that had no hint before that they might have it is super powerful. And there's a bunch of these like athletes that are now using this to better track their sleep, and Oura Ring is doing a lot of stuff, and Whoop, and there's a bunch of wearables companies that are coming out that enable people to better understand their bodies. And I think that information can be really, really valuable. So I'm not surprised that people have found these CGMs and other wearables to be really useful.
Yeah, to go on a little bit of a wearables tangent. So I have one of my smartwatches that tracks steps and heart rate and everything, but I also have something called a Polar Strap, and it's a way better way. So right now, my smartwatch is going off my wrist to monitor my heart rate, but ideally you'd want a device that's closer to where your heart is. That's what the Polar Strap is. You put it on, and it's right near your heart, and you usually use it when you exercise. So I tend to actually use both of them when I do exercise, and it's always interesting to see the differences in my heart rate of the Polar Strap, which is on my heart, relative to the smartwatch on my wrist.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and it's funky because a lot of statisticians, and when you're analyzing this data, you just assume that the data you get from the wearables is the ground truth, like it is measuring the true thing. But it's making a lot of approximations and using a lot of physics to try and tease out and predict what is the truth. And so there's this thing called measurement error, which is exactly what it sounds like. And it's the same thing that happened with the MRI and the salmon, that it seemed like it was capturing some information solely due to this random measurement error. So wearables have that same issue, and there's a pretty big line of work of people that work on these measurement error models. But I think wearables is such a different context than most other data and statistics that we're used to working with for so many years and decades, that it really presents a whole new world of problems to try and solve.
Yeah. So if you're getting into data analysis, data science, statistics, be skeptical of data. That's something.
Yes, always.
So,
yeah, no, garbage in, garbage out, and usually your data will be garbage. So just make sure that you are doing the right thing to tease out the information you want.
Okay, so sorry for the tangent. Let's back to the study itself of continuous glucose monitors. For the participants within the study, so you had those 450 participants. How did you group them together? Because that could potentially address the confounding variable issue that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, so luckily we didn't have to run the study, although it would be really, really cool to run one, but it's very expensive, very time consuming. And the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation did a great job of developing this. And so what they decided to do is randomly assign a bunch of people to wear the continuous glucose monitor, and a bunch of people to just use the standard prick and check monitoring method. And they made sure this randomization was within demographic groups so that you had comparability on these really important subgroups as well. So we didn't really have to do any grouping as far as it came to assigning people to treatment and control. They already did a great job. So that's an example of when your data is actually good and not garbage, just because they did a great job of designing the study.
That's great to hear. So one of the things that you mentioned, the standard approach is called time in healthy range. And this is that scalar metric that you were talking about. And this is calculated by taking the number of observed readings in the target range, usually within a blood glucose range of 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter, and dividing it by the total number of readings within the data set for a given period of time. This results in a single value ranging from 0 to 100%. Instead of summarizing the data in this scalar, what you chose to do is represent the data as full distributions and analyze them using your proposed method. So this is going to be a long one. Analyzing distributional data via matching after learning to stretch or add malts. Why did you choose to use this method instead of time and range?
Yeah, great question. I always chuckle. This was early on in my PhD when I was coming up with acronyms and names, and I still have not learned to shorten my names, unfortunately. But this is something to work on for the rest of the time. But I think so. The reason why we chose not to use time and range is because choosing a healthy range is really, really hard. For one patient, that 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter might be good, but for another patient, they might need something that's more personalized to them. And so the 70 to 180 doesn't really capture that full wealth of information that you get from wearables. But more than that, when you're looking at diabetic patients, they run the biggest risk of glucose shocks when their glucose levels are either super, super low or super, super high. Time and range measures how often are you within some healthy range, but it doesn't measure what's happening outside of these healthy ranges. And the last thing I will mention is that there's a few different time and ranges that researchers use. One is that 70 to 180 milligrams per deciliter. Another is 70 to 140 milligrams per deciliter. And it might not sound like a big difference. It's only 40 milligrams per deciliter, and glucose levels range anywhere from like 20 to 600. But when we reanalyze this clinical trial, changing the actual outcome that we care about, the range that we care about, we saw a 1,300 percentage point difference in the treatment effect based on your choice of range. And that's going to completely alter your decision making. And so it necessitates something that allows you to capture the complexities of this glucose monitoring data in a way that is more faithful to the data itself than just that single number, because it's not capturing the full information. If it was, there wouldn't be such a big discrepancy between these two statistics.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting way to approach this. So in terms of the efficacy of these continuous glucose monitoring instruments relative to the standard one, so just again, like you prick your finger, you put it on some sort of piece of paper, and then you put it in a little instrument. It reads your glucose. What did you find? What did your analysis find? How did the standard one compare to the CGM?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's a little hard to answer, and I'm going to caveat that with it's because analyzing this data is really, really hard. And this was a methods paper that was kind of motivated to convince people that we should be thinking about structuring the CGM data in a way that is more faithful to the actual CGM data instead of just using the standard time and range, and presenting a method to analyze it with this. But there's another thing that we often want to consider when we analyze this sort of data or make decisions, and it's just, what is the chance we saw this result due to random chance? Could we have just sampled some weird set of participants or just observed glucose levels at random weird times that just obscured everything? And this is a problem known as statistical inference. And that's something that we didn't tackle in this paper, but we're working on right now. And we don't have that just yet. So what we did find is that if we just trusted the data as being really, really good quality, which again, we really have to put a big asterisk on. But if we trusted that, what we found is that CGMs are really beneficial at reducing super high glucose levels for patients who are older than 55, but do a really, really, really good job of reducing the risk of super high glucose levels for patients who are older than 55 and who already had low hemoglobin A1C levels, which is just a biomarker that measures how much blood glucose was in their system for 3 months before. And those are patients who are typically eating very healthy diets and working out, and especially for patients who are older and have had diabetes for a much longer time span in their life, patients who are really actively trying really hard to mitigate the risk of diabetes. I'm not saying that patients with high HbA1c are not, but this is a subgroup where they absolutely must be if they also have diabetes. And so what we found is that for these patients, that CGM helps a lot. And intuitively, it kind of makes sense because if you are the type of patient where you are already doing a lot of stuff on your own to manage your glucose levels, then that device that gives you more information is going to help you better manage your glucose levels, and it's going to help you better manage your diet. So it reduces the risk of really, really high glucose levels. But the other flip side is that we saw that it didn't really change the risk of really low glucose levels at all. And this is kind of funky. You would expect that if it's reducing really high glucose levels, you would expect it to change really low glucose levels. And this is where it comes to you have to be careful with how much you trust the data. And what we found is that there wasn't a lot of comparability between patients in the treated arm that received that CGM and patients in the control arm who didn't receive the CGM, who also suffered from hypoglycemia, which is diabetic shocks that occur from low glucose levels. And so it could be the case that only patients in the treated arm had a risk of really low glucose levels or had pre-existing history of hypoglycemia in the past few years. And so as they're seeing their glucose monitor give them readings of really low glucose levels, they have to they are almost too cautious and too conservative. And they say, I can't let this dip anymore. And so they don't observe any change in low glucose levels. But it's also really hard to know this because we just don't have enough comparability for the subpopulation to compare them. So there definitely needs to be more research into how do CGMs help people manage their risk of hypoglycemia. But at least this gives us a sense of where can we trust and where can we not trust our data as a first step.
Yeah, that's fair. And so I was mentioning my friend that has type 1 diabetes. So he got a CGM. He says in terms of convenience that compared to the standard method of pricking your finger and getting blood, it's far easier. So this is anecdotal evidence. Of course, this is just a single user. But do you think that there's also a different measure that you could potentially do, such as quality of life or ease of use for CGMs versus the standard ones?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are really important things to measure and check because, and the other one should be cost as well. Because if you see that it's not really changing a lot of things, but it is reducing the quality of life or making things more expensive for patients, that's not really improving anything that we really care about. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure our patients are healthy, but they're also living a lifestyle that they want to live. And so we should be really measuring that whole suite of different things. And typically studies have multiple clinical endpoints that we care about.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And excited to see the next paper that comes out of this. Let us move on to your next paper on political polarization. So it's titled as a design-based solution for causal inference with text. Can a language model be too large? In the paper, you and your colleagues study how expressing intellectual humility affects the perceived persuasiveness of a political statement. So can you first, I really like the intellectual humility. It just with, I think maybe more social media and access to information, intellectual humility kind of seems out the door everywhere. But can you provide an example of intellectual humility in a political statement? And then can you also provide an example of an arrogant political statement?
Yeah. So I guess first, intellectual humility is all about acknowledging limitations in your own arguments, acknowledging counterpoints from other perspectives, and really just saying there's some uncertainty and that you don't have perfect information to make the statement that you're making. And even if you are the preeminent expert in this area, I don't think preeminent is the right word, but if you are the expert in this area, you still might not have perfect information. And it is about that language that you use when communicating information. So an example of a intellectually humble political statement might be something like, I'm no expert, but I really think we need stronger gun control. I see children, dying in schools, and this is really, really unfortunate. I understand how having access to guns to defend yourself is a noble effort and a noble cause, but we should work towards finding a middle ground so that we are not, sacrificing children. And I realize it's very political, so I apologize if I offended anybody.
We're talking. Neither of us is making a statement. This is purely we're measuring how, you're measuring how these statements affect the persuasiveness for it.
Yeah. So this was intellectually humble because they acknowledged that, they're not an expert. And they acknowledged other perspectives and counterpoints about wanting to defend their own rights and making sure they have access to the Second Amendment, and acknowledging that there is some uncertainty. I don't know, maybe use the word probably or something like that in this language.
Yeah. So it's, I oftentimes when I talk about things, I'm like, maybe this or maybe that, but I'm completely uncertain, and people always take it as a cop out. But it's like, I'm kind of trained to do that. I can't tell you for certain, especially when it comes to human centric events. There's that's like the definition of uncertainty.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
But so you and your colleagues used a design it's pretty interesting. It's called the writer editor. Can you describe how this works?
Yeah, so I guess a little bit before that, it's worth introducing why we care about writers and editors. And so oftentimes when we want to understand what's the effect of this linguistic property like intellectual humility, you might just want to compare the effects of some intellectually humble statement to some not intellectually humble statement. So the one I just gave, the other not in the arrogant version of that would be, are you stupid? Like, guns are hurting people across the country right now. If you don't agree with me, you don't deserve to live. Like something that is that extreme, obviously to the complete extreme, but it employs this other language that's not only arrogant, but is also just really, really violent. Like, you don't deserve to exist is a really powerful statement. And you could, and some reaction to this statement might be driven by the violence of that other statement instead of the actual intellectual humility or intellectual arrogance. And so isolating those relationships and figuring out whether it's that confounding variable of like the violence of the statement versus the actual humility component is really, really complicated. It's not like just giving you a pill or a sugar pill where everything looks exactly the same except for whether there's that chemical in the pill or not. Now we have to think more critically about how do we compare two pieces of language. And so what the writer-editor design does is it employs a bunch of people to write and express natural arguments in a way that is humble or not humble, or that exhibits some linguistic property or doesn't exhibit that linguistic property. And then it uses a bunch of other people, editors, to now edit these statements to preserve everything as much as possible and modify only the linguistic property we care about. So, for example, if that statement was, I'm no expert, but I think we should get rid of guns. Now, the intellectually arrogant version of this would be, we definitely need to get rid of guns. And that definitely, and the removal of the I'm no expert allows us to make a more apples to apples comparison between reactions to these and attribute whatever difference we see in reactions to the actual humility versus arrogance. And so the writer-editor tries to make that modification more directly using this design.
Yeah. So you're measuring the causal effect of a change in political statement. It's cool that you have both the treatment and the control, and you have a data set. I know it's posted up on GitHub. I linked that as well for anybody that wants to check this out and kind of get a better understanding and maybe even run your own calculations on it if you want. But you have the example of gun control. You could also have something like climate change is happening and it's very real versus climate change may or may not be happening. We need to study it more. You have arrogant versus the humble statement. So you gave both the arrogant and humble statements, measured the change in how the statements were received across multiple results. So, but to simplify things, we can focus on the change in how the persuasiveness work for the reader? So you actually have somebody that's reading the treatment statement where it's there's intellectual humility. Then you have the control with the arrogance statement. How did the writer, editor design compare to the benchmarks you use? And what were the benchmarks that you used in this paper?
Yeah, so I guess it's worth noting that our design, we didn't really compare it to like other ways of calculating things because it's really hard to compare a design or one kind of design to another kind of design. The main other kind of design you can compare to is just saying, I'm just going to show a bunch of people a bunch of different political statements and just compare them all together without considering, am I making apples to apples comparisons or apples to oranges comparisons? And when we compare to apples to oranges comparisons, there are pretty big biases, mainly driven by like the topic that you're talking about, for example. And once you consider the topic that you talk about, things change a little bit. And then finally, when we get down to these latent components about like the violence of the text, now that we're making more apples to apples comparisons based on the violence, we can attribute more specific effects to like humility. And so that's what our design enables us to do, attribute those directly to humility, whereas the other designs have a hard time doing that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So your design is more robust. Hopefully that's the right word to describe it. But so with the actual benchmarks themselves, you had something like a simple bag of words. And then you also compared your design to a large language model. How did that fare?
Yeah, so that's I understand where you're going with the question now. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
So one of the things that our design allows us to do is that because our design gives us a, like you said, more robust answer, we can now design, not to overuse the word, we can now create other semi-synthetic data sets where we have a lot of control over what's happening under the hood and where we can understand, again, what is this ground truth treatment effect and figure out how do other estimators with their own assumptions apply to these? So the bag of words that you mentioned, which just figures out how often are just any words show up in any of the different texts. That's one way to represent the text, and it throws away any sort of temporal information. So if you said, I am Yoda or Yoda am I, both of those would have the same exact bag of words representation, even though, Yoda am I is kind of weird. That's like one way of representing the text, and then you can estimate stuff based on that. And the other one is to say, use a large language model. And what a large language model is doing at the end of the day is it's taking in a bunch of text. It's doing a lot of math and computation and finding a way to basically turn all of this complex, messy language into numbers. So if you remember like your XY axis from like algebra 2 or whatever, that is the type of space that we are now representing all of this complex language in mathematically. And now this gives us a nice set of numbers to do more computation on top of. So those are examples of two different ways of representing this text. And what we see is that these large language models, which are supposed to be really, really good at modeling text, do a really bad job at estimating causal effects. And our design gives us a way to collect really trustworthy data, which is what we did. And then second, ensure that we can create these experiments to benchmark these large language model stuff. So we know what the ground truth is, and now we can compare it to these other things. And large language models, which are supposed to be really, really good at modeling this text for prediction, does a really bad job at causation. And the reason why is because we have really important assumptions in causal inference. One of the ones we talked about is this idea of there should be no unobserved confounding. There should be no other possible explanation why something happens. But there's this other one called positivity, and we kind of alluded to it in the CGM study. And this assumption basically just ensures that you need to have comparability between your treated population and your control population. It can't be the case that everybody in your treated population gets the ice cream and then also gets to play basketball. And then everybody in the control arm doesn't get ice cream, they get their yogurt bar, but then they also have to do math homework. If that's the case, you can't tell why things were different between these two groups. You can't say it's solely due to ice cream or Yasso bar. It could also be due to basketball versus homework. And so we have the same kind of problem in text. And because we're taking this really messy data and the language model is representing this in some other mathematical dimensions, it's possible that it actually enforces these two sets of text to be in completely different spaces, because it does a really, really good job of finding out what things predict the outcomes. And one of the things that predicts the outcome is that humility. And so it creates this basically way of separating out these two populations and enforces what is known as a positivity violation. And so now it's just going to say there is no difference between these two groups, but it could actually be the case that there is a difference. It's just found the wrong representation of this data. I hope that makes sense and it wasn't too complex.
No, I mean, the some of these concepts are going to be complex, and I mean, when I listen to technical podcasts, I have to re-listen sometimes more than once, and hopefully it just gets people thinking about things. So yeah, so in terms of, so they have the issue with the LLMs and even bag of words, which is a even simpler method of dealing with confounding variables and positivity. So what did you use some sort of mean squared error? I can't remember what the metric was that you actually compared the different benchmarks to.
Yeah, so essentially what we did is we had our original data set that had about 6,000 text rating observations. And now we sampled some of these to create some smaller data sets and figure out how would variation look like in the real world if we had a smaller data set and had different samples of these smaller data sets. And we went through and we applied each of like the language model and bag of words based estimators to represent the text to each of these smaller data sets. And we just said, what is the treatment effect that was estimated from each of these different methods? And then we simply just looked at what is the error or what is the distance between what is given from our approach, which gives us that unbiased effect.
Kind of like it's coming back to me like similar to a Euclidean distance, right?
Yeah, so I don't think we actually ever give out any strict numbers that compare these two, but we do have this nice visual that says the language model stuff is so far off from any notion of ground truth from our like calculations from our design.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And then I think this is also a really good finding that you found that's for those getting into data science and machine learning. So you had bag of words, and kind of like you were saying, bag of words, classic natural language processing method where you take a document, you have a collection of words, grammar isn't factored in. Like you said, I am Yoda, Yoda am I, same thing in terms of this method. But you found that the bag of words actually did better than the LLM. Can you talk about that? Because that's really interesting. And that kind of goes back to sometimes you should look at simple models first.
Yeah, so that I completely glossed over that, but yeah, bag of words did outperform LLMs, and I think it has to do with the setup that we had. And the setup we had was super, super simple. And because we had the data and we collected it, we could now modify it in ways that we could control. And we modified it in a really, really simple way that something even as simple as this bag of words thing, which just says this I am Yoda and Yoda am I is the same exact thing, is able to get right, and the language model is not able to get right. And the reason why is because of how seemingly simple this setup that we had was. So it's not to say that simple stuff will always get everything right, but it's more to say that even in simple settings, the complicated stuff can get things wrong. But the simple things have this nice benefit of being a little bit more quote unquote interpretable, where I can go through and I can say which words were actually highlighted in this model that I care about and try to debug whatever is going on. And I can say, oh, you know what? I don't think it should be focusing on I am no expert, because that is very highly indicative of intellectual humility. But I could maybe focus, I could remove that stuff and now do other things. So in the data science pipeline, you are able to have more clear like developer or data scientist to data set interaction pipelines than with these black box methods where you just have no idea what's going on under the hood.
Yeah, it's interpreted, especially it depends on what you're doing. If you just need text generated real quick and a quick answer, interpretability may not be the most important thing. But when you want to know the underlying process, statistical inference, that you kind of need interpretability.
Yeah, I'm glad you agree. I think there's a lot of skeptics, but it is really useful to know what is happening and why it's happening, especially for a lot of like prediction tasks. This is going to be a little bit of an aside, but one of my advisors, Cynthia Rudin, is one of the biggest names in interpretable machine learning, and one of like the most classic examples of like why interpretability is useful, especially for this debugging pipeline, is back in the day, the army was trying to predict whether there was a tank in an image. And for some reason, they were able to get like near 100% accuracy. And they're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. We have to deploy this. We are going to do this. And it failed in the real world. It did so bad. And then they realized that it was because their data set was really, really bad. And all the pictures of the tanks were taken during the day, and all the pictures of the no tanks were taken during the night. And so classifying when there is light versus when there is no light in the image is really, really easy. But classifying when there's a tank and when there's not a tank is really, really hard. And so because the data was really, really bad, the interpretable model would allow you to identify that, oh, we're just learning about day versus night, and this data is garbage, and we need to do something to fix it. Whereas the black box model, you kind of just have to assume that your data and trust that your data is good. When we talked about it, it really hardly ever is. So interpretability is really helpful, especially for these high stakes decisions, like trying to figure out when there's a tank in an image. For a lot of these things. And these same examples come up a lot of the times in medical decision making and a lot of social science and public health and public policy problems. So it really comes up a lot of the times, and knowing what is happening is like almost invaluable. Not almost, it is invaluable.
That's a really interesting example. I'll have to look it up, but
oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah, plenty of examples of that. So let's finish up on the political polarization. So just from your personal opinion, I'm curious, do you think we're in a more politically polarized world than average? We're kind of focused on the United States here. It can very widely vary from country to country, but to simplify things, kind of looking at different points of time, political polarization here was probably at its apex in the 1860s when we had the Civil War. And you kind of look at different periods of time, and 1920s and 30s, you had the Great Depression. Then people were questioning, like, do we want a constitutional republic? Maybe we'll go with communism or fascism. So I just kind of looking throughout our period in time, it seems very intense, maybe like compared to the 90s or even the mid 2010s but I don't know. It's like I don't know that we're really deviating. This is very subjective, but from my subjective opinion, I don't know that we're really deviating in terms of political polarization than what we've seen historically.
Yeah, so I will caveat this by saying I'm not a statistician. I am an even less of a political scientist, like way less. And it's great because I get to talk to really smart political scientists, but I can never make any claims about political science. And I apologize to anybody that is more politically savvy than I am. But I think a lot of what is happening now is like this example with the Civil War. I think society was polarized, but there wasn't necessarily a lot of engagement between opposite sides. And so there were kind of these nice clusters where everybody was existing within themselves and they didn't really have to interact with others. Whereas now, when we live in a globalized and like digitized society, everybody interacts with everybody, even if you're on opposite sides of the world. And so what we end up having is exposure to a lot of different viewpoints, and viewpoints that you don't agree with, and viewpoints that you know are fundamentally different than yours, and you know you don't agree with, but you don't know how to express that you don't agree with them. And so what that causes is people to become even more extreme potentially because of of this behavior, specifically due to social media and the digitization. And there was this experiment that our lab conducted where they were on Twitter and they were asking, can we, actually, I don't know if it was our lab. There's some paper out there that tries to study, if I were to expose you to someone of the opposite political viewpoint, would that encourage you to become less depolarized? So would that allow you to move more towards the middle and meet a common ground? And what they found was a complete opposite effect, that it moved people to complete other extremes, because as they heard other perspectives, they were like, wait, no, I feel even more solidified in my own. And that's the kind of society and world we live in today, where it is a lot of exposure and constant exposure to other perspectives. So I don't know if I can really say historically we live in a more politically polarized society than we did in the past, because there's so many different confounding factors. But I think what we can say is that social media plays a role in how we engage and interact with people in a way that has never been possible before. And that has different implications for polarization and society.
Yeah. And so, so that's kind of like a digital exposure to the different side. This wouldn't really be feasible because it would be ridiculously expensive. And there's a lot of reasons why, like, communication is just digitally easier. We have Zoom. So flying to meet somebody across the world who has a different opinion, that's very laborious and economically probably doesn't make sense. But I do think perspective is very important, and in-person discussions usually they're extreme cases, but for the most part, when you're together with a person in a relaxed environment and you're in a different country, experience new things, hear new perspectives, I would have to guess, again, so just subjectively going kind of through how I think it would work, is most people would be like, oh, it's I don't agree with this, but like we both have families, we both enjoy fishing and hiking and things like that. So I just, not feasible to like take everybody that has the exact opposite opinion, fly them to, like, even within the United States. I know a lot of people highlight people in the US don't have passports, but if we're comparing ourselves to Western Europe, we're a way bigger country. So even getting from the East Coast to the West Coast takes that could be pretty expensive. But yeah, so I would just have to educated guess that's subjective. Most people that would meet in person, the more exposure you have, I assume conflicts would pop up, but overall, I think the political polarization would shrink a bit.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to be able to tell, because I could see arguments for both sides. Like, yeah, I would expect us to focus on the common ground, but the common ground is kind of less interesting sometimes. And I think especially like the voices that are most prominent on social media are the ones that are a little bit contrarian. And the ones that are contrarian are oftentimes very extreme. And so when we have these, especially new generations that grow up consuming very extreme media, that is kind of the world they live in and what they consume. And maybe they don't have a chance to necessarily find that common ground with the world around them. And instead they just focus on the really loud, extreme voices. But again, I'm not an expert in this, so I can't say. I think you could totally be right.
I think it's a fair point. This gets out of like just political science and into psychology, and maybe it needs to be exposure at a very young age. But if you're at a very young age, you probably don't really have strong political opinions, because I've never talked to my students about politics, but I assume that they could care less. And it's funny, just as you get older, you kind of tend to suck more, and you're like, oh, like I'm just, you're just getting angry at whatever news outlet you're usually reading. And yeah, I don't know, maybe we should focus on being teenagers and like experimenting, trying new things.
No, definitely. I will say though, back in my high school, a lot of people were definitely interested in politics, but I was also like peak election 2016 was like when I was in high school. And so I think a lot of people started social media and then also got a lot of ads and they were all talking about it constantly. Cause I mean, how interesting is history class when you're living through it instead? So I think for a lot of people then they got really interested in it. And at the time, at least I and a lot of my friends were pretty polarized and on extremes. We still, got along fine with other people, but we did definitely had more extreme ideas. And as I've like grown up, not that I'm like a real adult yet, but as I've grown up, I feel like I've just come to the conclusion that just everybody is wrong and everybody needs to chill. So it's really, it's it's surprising you hear that you like your students don't engage with politics that much, but maybe
Yeah.
that's sometimes a good thing so that they focus on just being kids.
Yeah, I assume it probably varies, but I just thinking back to my experience in suburban Pennsylvania and then also suburban Philadelphia. I don't think that half the people could have named the president or let alone the vice president. So it's kind of interesting, and it's if you're 18 or under, like don't focus too much on politics. Go, I don't know, go skateboard, go hiking. It's like
Do fun stuff. Yeah.
Politics is good. Like it's good to read about geopolitics, but it's also it's kind of like sports where my brother's a big Eagles fan. I mean, I'm so busy. I don't have time for sports, let alone like 4 hours every Sunday. But the Eagles lost, and I know that I can't text him that weekend because I know he's going to be angry. So it's kind of like the same thing. Like I mean, maybe on a local level, you can affect politics, but on a national level, it's kind of, it's a random event that occurs that's out of your control. So I'm definitely more along the lines of like, keep yourself informed, but if an event occurs that's like out of the scope of your control, for the most part, I think it's kind of detrimental to yourself if that breaks you.
Yeah. I will say, like if you want to get into politics, because it really can be interesting, like be careful where you're getting it from. Like don't just go off of the latest Facebook post or just whatever you see online, including whatever I'm saying right now. Maybe I'm all wrong, and I totally could be. But like do your own research and come up with your own conclusions, and who knows where you'll end up. You might be the next Malala and revolutionize your country, or at the very least, you'll be another teenager that has other fun stuff going on too. So don't let it ruin your world, but just, if you're interested and want to learn more, do your research and kind of learn.
Yep. Yeah, I agree. So let's pivot into some of the more fun questions. Don't let the Python logo on the door affect your answer. But what's your favorite programming language?
That's really tough. My go-tos are R and Python. But it really depends on like what I'm doing. There was a time where I would like try to make these like small video games, essentially, like super simple. But back then it was using like Swift and C++, and those were like super fun at the time, but only because, I'm making video games. That's so much better than doing homework. But now it's like, I don't know. I don't think I necessarily have a favorite. It's just whatever is nicest for the job at hand. I think one of the really fun things has been like making visualizations. And I think R has a really great visualization environment and interface, whereas Python's is a little bit harder to work with. But I will say for like any sort of algorithmic thing, Python is easier. So I don't know. I don't really have a favorite. It's kind of just, if you're not going to yell at me for using something, I'm just going to use what is easiest. And nowadays too, with like code agents and all these different things, the differences between languages have kind of like shrunk a little bit. Where if you develop something in one thing, it's really easy to translate it to something else. So it's kind of just whatever is the mood for the task, and whatever I'm vibing with.
Yeah, fair enough. So when I was going through the graduate program, I'm a big Pythonista. If other people want to use other things, that's fine. But almost everybody else used R. And I just have a preference for Python for multiple reasons. I just think you just have a lot more packages there. But I will say R did at that point 5, 6 years ago have just in general better statistical models to work with, whereas Python was far more generalized.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree on that. R is a statistical programming language. It is statisticians' bread and butter, and they focus a lot of their time and effort on making new software for that. And so it's really, really good for a lot of stats modeling, whereas Python has become the predominant language for a lot of deep learning. And so it has really, really strong capabilities for that and a sort of GPU computing. So I think, both have their strengths and weaknesses. So I can't really say one is my favorite over the other. But if someone said, go train a neural network on R, I think I would give them a stink eye.
Yeah, I totally get it. So I know you're into board games. What are some of your favorites?
So I used to think I was into board games until I met someone that was really into board games, and I realized, wow, I'm a novice.
I've talked to people that have developed their own Dungeons and Dragons. I've actually never played. Like at this point, I've met so many people that have done it. I guess one of the things that hesitates me is another thing I need to learn, and I might get sucked into it, like video games. Right. But yeah, I'm sure that. Okay, so what are your favorite board games?
Right now, I think the ones that are coming most to mind, whenever I go see my parents, they have been obsessed with this game called Azul. It's basically just a board that you try to build, like tiles. And it's really just a very fun and like almost mindless game that's fun to play, I think, with the people, because my parents really like to play. But with my friends, I really like to play this game called Wingspan. And it's basically just, you have a bunch of birds and you're trying to collect birds. And it sounds really lame, but it's really just fun to play with. And it's an easy way to chat with people while doing it. So I am by no means like an huge board game is my biggest thing kind of stuff. But I think those two have been really fun recently.
I gotcha. Yeah, no, I'll definitely look them up. So one of the last things is book recommendations. I just want to mention one kind of that gets to some of the political polarization. It's called The Most Human Human, and it talked about chatbots. I think the book came out somewhere between 2015 and 18, before large language models were a thing. And it's a history of chatbots. There was one chatbot that was developed in the 1980s at a university. I can't remember which one. What they did was they made the chatbot say like very angry things to people, like, "Hey, stupid, look over here." And it would message people this on, I think it was the computer system, and the people could reply. And it was just a mindless reply where it just like kept insulting the person. But there was it had a defined bank of insults, and it would just go through and it would just hurl insults at this person. And there'd be a real human arguing with this very, very simple, I hesitate to call it an algorithm, but they would be arguing with it. And what the researchers found is that even though this is a simple thing that's not even going off of any like predefined things like, oh, he said this, so let me do this. It was just going through a fixed set of angry insults. People would engage for it for like 20 or 40 minutes before realizing that it was just they were arguing with like a computer. So
that's so funny.
But yeah. So I think that's just a good way of illustrating how anger works and kind of getting to the political polarization of things. And I often think when people quote X, or formerly known as Twitter, or other social media platforms, is that even a human? Is it just a robot? Or is it one of those click farms where they have these set up in countries? And it's interesting because like some of these are actually set up by states, like intelligence agencies that are meant to foster people like a anger response. I think for the most part, it's probably going to be robots. But yeah, so whenever I hear somebody quote a Twitter post, I'm like, I need to discount that as soon as I hear that. Like I need to know that it's a human.
Yeah, no, I think that's really funny. I feel like it's funny you bring up Twitter, especially because I feel like bot has become an insult to anything that people just don't like as well. Where I think on Reddit as well, well, they just be like, "You're a bot." So I think, especially now with like different LLMs and being able to create really human generated uncanny valley kind of text, it's really hard to detect when something is a bot versus not. And there's a lot of interesting sociology research going on around studying what are like societal interactions between bots and humans. So I think it's funny that it was even there so long ago. But really, bot interactions can make people angry so quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I've never my consumption of social media has always been sparse relative to other people. Where I mean, I had Facebook in high school, maybe into early college, completely deleted that. All my social media accounts are related to the podcast or my YouTube channel for the most part, and I can't say I'm on X a lot, but it's very curated. Like, I took the time to get every political thing out of there, because if I'm going to consume political news, I'll go to the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Financial Times, or other sources. I'm not really going to go. I will say, like, when things that are, and you have to be very careful, but when very big geopolitical events happen and people are on the ground, X can be very interesting to view, but you still have to be very skeptical, because especially now with like AI generated content, how much can you trust it? So that's about the only time I may try to use it, outside of my typical use of it's highly curated to me, where scientific papers or engineering related feeds. So I can't say that I really use social media like the typical person I imagine does.
Yeah, no, I think that is a very good move, because, as we mentioned, it can become really extreme and bring about some interesting emotions. So I've also gotten off X almost entirely. I think LinkedIn is my
I will
biggest social media.
even LinkedIn. It's kind of, I mean, like I like post about my podcast, so that might be annoying to people, but it's very, I get it. Like, marketing is very important, but it seems that I hear more stories, which I understand, but definitely more along the lines of, I kind of want to see your paper on archive. I'm not sure that it's great that you're celebrating this event, but I don't really see how. So yeah, even LinkedIn, I'm kind of like wary of reading. Like, it's a great source because I use it to prepare for this podcast, but the actual content on it is very meh.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it is like sometimes interesting. The reason why I shared it on LinkedIn is just to like get awareness from other academics, because there's so much stuff coming out all the time. At least having something where it can raise awareness is like sometimes helpful. And usually that comes from like really big names where I am absolutely not. So it's kind of just a little bit of, okay, I'll just expose my name out there.
Yeah, no, I like, I appreciate that kind of content. Like, again,
Oh, sure.
please
Yeah.
post your archive, your paper, and like, so I can read it. But if it's your cat's birthday and you're kind of trying to tie that into some business professional concept, like, I like, if you feel like you want to do that, fine. It's just like, I don't see the value in that.
No, I totally agree.
So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just like a lot of people trying to tie seemingly, at least to me, very random events to some, this is a learning lesson, I can bring this into my business or my work in academia. And I'm like, I don't think your cat's bird. I've never seen this. I'm sorry if somebody really like.
Neither have I, but I'm sure somebody has done this at some point.
Yeah, if your cat's birthday is very pivotal, I don't mean to, I guess, demean that too much, but I don't know. I think it's kind of, you definitely see more of that clickbait content that you would see in other social media platforms.
No, that's so true. LinkedIn has also been attacked by the bug. But yeah, no social media platform is safe. But yeah, I forget what we were even talking about beforehand.
Oh,
Oh yeah,
well,
bots.
so, but yeah,
Yeah.
bots, but like book recommendations. So if you do have one, it could be something you read recently or way back, could be nonfiction, fiction.
I have been like fiction and fantasy have been a little bit of my like way to stress relieve and just like do other stuff outside of reading academic papers so much. So I don't read as much nonfiction, but fantasy wise, one of my favorite books and series is called the Mistborn series. It's a fantasy, but it has like comparatively less romance compared to other recent fantasy books,
Like a Game of
which I think is
Thrones.
I'm thinking more like A Court of Thorns and Roses, for example. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's taken over
Yeah.
TikTok.
Interesting. Yeah.
But
Fantasy is never like a lot of nonfiction behind me, a lot of history.
nice, as you are becoming smarter and smarter, and here we.
It's questionable.
Yeah, I definitely used to read a lot of history and nonfiction back in the day, but after like reading papers as like 40
You
hours a
have to
day.
decompress. I get
Right.
it.
So yeah, the Mistborn series has been really cool. It's a lot of like interesting world building and magic systems, and there's interesting character growth. And the writer does a really good job of having really intense endings that have a lot of twists that you wouldn't expect. So it's kind of cool to see that played out. So that's probably the biggest one that I read recently that I was like, oh, this is cool. But again, I'm also not a huge book person. I'm sure anybody reading fantasy hears me say that and is like, this kid he's just a kid in this world. He doesn't know what he's talking about. But I really, really enjoyed that series.
Nice. No, it's always great. All right. Srikar Katta, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, looking forward to seeing when this comes out. And yeah, I appreciate you having me on here.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, everybody.